Across much of the world, when the lights go out for a moment, people barely notice. A few seconds, maybe a minute, and everything hums back to life. But in many parts of Africa, every blackout brings a familiar heaviness: machines, falling silent, hospital corridors, dimming families, lighting candles with a quiet hope that power will return soon. Energy for millions is not just a service. It is the thin line between stability and uncertainty. And yet, in a place long described by outsiders as too unstable, too inexperienced, too underdeveloped to handle advanced technology, something remarkable has just happened quietly, without fanfare, without applause from Western headlines. South Africa has secured a 20-year life extension for the continent's only operational nuclear power plant. No dramatic announcement, no global celebration. Just a simple fact that carries enormous weight: Africa has safely operated a nuclear facility for more than 40 years and will now continue doing so until at least 2045. That silence you hear from major international news outlets, it's the sound of a narrative collapsing. Because this moment forces the world to confront a truth it has avoided for decades: Africa is capable. Africa is disciplined. Africa can manage high-precision, high-risk, world-class infrastructure and do it with consistency. And that's why you're here. Because behind what looks like a technical decision lies a story far bigger than South Africa itself. A story about power, dignity, and the future of an entire continent. Why does a 20-year extension for the Koeberg nuclear plant matter so much? How did a facility built in the 1980s survive political transitions, economic shocks, global pressure, and still meet the toughest safety standards on Earth? And more importantly, what does this mean for Africa's ability to control its own future? If you want to understand why this moment could reshape energy industry and sovereignty across Africa, stay with me. Please like, share, and subscribe if you believe that truth and clarity matter more than headlines. When we talk about the Koeberg nuclear power plant, we are not just talking about a power station. We are talking about a piece of infrastructure that has lived through nearly half a century of global change. Built in the early 1980s during a time when South Africa was defined more by political conflict than technological ambition, Koeberg has quietly served as the backbone of the nation's electricity grid. It has outlasted presidents, endured economic collapses, and remained standing while countless coal plants around it aged, cracked, and faltered. And now, after a review process so demanding that even some European reactors struggle to pass it, Koeberg has been granted the right to continue operating for another 20 years. This is the main event. This is the story that changes everything. Let's begin with what actually happened. In 2024, South Africa's national nuclear regulator completed a multi-year assessment of Koeberg's Unit 2. This wasn't a symbolic evaluation or a political gesture. Nuclear regulators do not deal in symbolism. Their job is to protect human life, and they do it with strictness bordering on obsession. If there is one loose bolt, one aging weld, one miscalibrated sensor, they shut everything down. And yet, after thousands of pages of technical reviews, on-site inspections, stress tests, structural evaluations, and emergency simulations, Unit 2 was approved to operate until 2045. Not because someone wanted good PR, not because South Africa needed a miracle, but because Koeberg met every requirement, thoroughly, confidently, and repeatedly. This extension came just after Unit 1 earned its own life renewal. For the first time in history, Africa's only nuclear plant has both reactors licensed for continued long-term operation. That is the event. But to understand why it is groundbreaking, we need to understand what it takes to earn such approval. During the regulatory review, inspectors examined nearly every part of the plant reactor pressure vessel integrity, ensuring the steel can endure decades of neutron bombardment. Cooling system reliability, the most essential element of nuclear safety. Seismic resilience testing, whether the plant can survive an earthquake. Fuel handling protocols monitored down to the smallest step. Emergency preparedness drills rehearsed again and again without shortcuts. Radiation containment ensuring no leaks, no weak points, no compromises. Steam generator performance, a key measure of reactor health. Aging management plans, detailed strategies covering every component. This wasn't good enough. This wasn't acceptable. This was world-class. For decades, Africa has been told that nuclear energy is too advanced, too sensitive, too dangerous for the continent. Commentators repeated the same lines: Africa doesn't have the institutions. Africa doesn't have the discipline. Africa doesn't have the engineering culture. But while these analysts sat in comfortable offices writing global reports, Koeberg quietly proved them wrong for 40 straight years. The plant survived apartheid, survived democratic transition, survived waves of corruption, scandals, survived an unstable national grid, and yet itself remained stable. Koeberg did not melt down. Koeberg did not experience major accidents. Koeberg did not violate international nuclear standards. Instead, it consistently powered millions of homes, factories, mines, hospitals, and water systems with a reliability unmatched by any other energy source in the country. And that brings us to the heart of why this extension is transformative. Together, Koeberg's two units generate roughly 860 megawatts of electricity, not peak, not intermittent, but constant. This type of 24/7 power is known as base load. Without base load, a modern economy cannot function. Solar disappears at sunset. Wind slows down at night. Hydro drops during drought. But nuclear keeps running quietly, steadily, faithfully, regardless of weather season or political situation. If Koeberg were to shut down tomorrow, South Africa would plunge into a severe energy crisis. Factories would halt, hospitals would scramble. The country would face one of the worst load-shedding disasters in its history. The 20-year extension prevents that collapse. It buys South Africa time, precious time to build renewable infrastructure correctly, not in panic mode. And that is why this moment matters. There is a moment in every story when everything turns, when the doubts, the whispers, and the old assumptions fall away. For Koeberg, that moment came the day the National Nuclear Regulator delivered its final verdict. The announcement was simple, almost understated. Unit 2 had met all long-term safety structural and regulatory criteria. But behind that short statement was a revelation powerful enough to shake decades of global skepticism. This right here was the climax. Because for more than 40 years, the world had insisted that Africa could not do this, could not maintain a nuclear facility at the highest international standards, could not keep it safe, could not preserve its integrity across economic crises, political transitions, or leadership changes. Yet when the paperwork was finally stamped, the reality was undeniable. Koeberg had not only matched global expectations, it had exceeded them. And the silence that followed said everything. Normally, when a developing country accomplishes something extraordinary, the world rushes to congratulate. But not this time. No headlines on BBC, no special coverage on CNN. No editorials in major Western papers asking, how did Africa achieve this? Why the silence? Because Koeberg's success does not fit the narrative, the world is used to telling the narrative of a continent struggling with instability, incapable of mastering complex systems, forever needing outside supervision. Koeberg's extension didn't merely challenge that narrative, it shattered it. And shattered narratives often bring silence, not applause. Inside engineering circles in Europe and North America, the reaction was less about celebration and more about discomfort. Many Western countries have been shutting down their nuclear power plants because they cannot meet upgraded safety standards or political pressure has made nuclear unpopular. Germany shut down its reactors. France struggles with aging fleets. The United States is spending billions just to keep existing reactors alive. Meanwhile, Africa, the continent, those same nations often described as underdeveloped, has kept a nuclear facility running safely through every challenge thrown at it. That reversal of expectation is what produced the quiet shock. While the West hesitated to speak, African nations were watching closely, very closely. And what they saw was not just a South African victory. They saw a blueprint, a living, breathing example of what is possible when discipline meets long-term thinking. Egypt looked at Koeberg and saw confirmation that its massive El Dabaa project can thrive. Nigeria saw validation for its pursuit of small modular reactors to power industrial zones. Kenya, Ghana, Rwanda, Uganda, and Zambia saw the psychological barrier dissolve. Nuclear energy was no longer a distant dream, but a real workable path. For the first time, Africa had a homegrown model, not a borrowed one. A model that didn't come from France, the United States, or Japan, but from the southern tip of its own continent. And that changed everything. In South Africa, especially among engineers and technicians who have dedicated decades of their lives to Koeberg, the extension sparked something deeper than pride. It sparked vindication. For years, these workers were overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. Yet it was their hands, African hands, that kept the plant safe and stable. Imagine being one of the technicians who checks reactor coolant valves at 3 a.m. year after year in silence. Imagine being one of the inspectors who signs off on equipment after months of preparation. Imagine being one of the operators who lives with the weight of knowing that a single mistake could endanger millions. For these people, the extension was not just an administrative decision, it was recognition. It was proof that their discipline, their training, and their dedication were world-class, something that critics had refused to believe for decades. What truly marks the turning point is not the regulatory approval itself. It is the psychological transformation that follows. Koeberg forced Africa to see itself differently. It forced the world to see Africa differently. And it forced a long-overdue conversation about what the continent can achieve when it is not limited by outside expectations. This is the moment the story stops being about a single nuclear plant and starts being about the future of an entire continent. When a nuclear plant receives a 20-year extension, the impact is not limited to government offices, regulatory agencies, or engineers in control rooms. The consequences reach ordinary people. First, the factory worker, the nurse on a night shift, the small business owner who worries every time the lights flicker. To understand why Koeberg's renewal matters, we must begin with them. South Africans know the pain of rolling blackouts, the uncertainty that shadows every evening, every work schedule, every family gathering. Power cuts have shaped daily life in a way that few outside the continent can truly grasp. But with Koeberg secured until 2045, one major source of this fear begins to loosen its grip. Hospitals can keep life support machines running without relying on emergency generators. Schools and universities can function without interruption. Families no longer have to choose between safety and darkness. Businesses, from small shops to heavy industry, can operate knowing that at least one pillar of the grid will not collapse. The extension is not just a technical approval, it is a form of relief. In a modern nation, electricity is not merely a utility, it is the bloodstream of economic life. And nuclear electricity, steady, predictable, uninterrupted, is the rarest and most valuable kind of power. Manufacturing plants cannot afford to shut down mid-production. Mining operations cannot go dark without risking worker safety. Digital infrastructure, banking systems, data centers, telecoms requires round-the-clock power. If Koeberg had gone offline, South Africa would have faced years of instability, billions in emergency spending, and a collapse in investor confidence. Instead, the country now has a 20-year window to expand renewable energy, strengthen the grid, develop battery storage, and modernize its entire energy planning without rushing into costly mistakes. Investors notice this. Manufacturers notice this. Regional partners notice this. A stable energy anchor is the difference between an economy in survival mode and an economy planning for transformation. In a country where energy shortages have fueled political division, public frustration, and declining trust in institutions, the successful relicensing of Koeberg arrives as a rare moment of national competence. It demonstrates that long-term planning is still possible, expertise still exists within state institutions, and critical infrastructure can be preserved despite political turbulence. Politicians cannot easily manipulate a nuclear review. The process is too rigorous, too transparent, too independent. That is precisely why the extension feels so important. It is one of the few major achievements that cannot be attributed to spin or political theater. It is real. And real success carries political weight. Across the continent, leaders are watching closely. Koeberg's extension proves that Africa can keep high-precision infrastructure running for decades, through instability, through change, through hardship. It tells African governments that they do not have to settle for short-term donor-driven energy projects. They can build systems meant to last a lifetime. It also shifts power in a geopolitical sense. Nations with reliable electricity have negotiating leverage. They attract industries. They command respect. They shape regional trade patterns. A continent that can control its energy future can also control its political future. The civil and political consequences of Koeberg's renewal ripple outward from households to city grids, from local politics to continental identity. It strengthens faith, stabilizes planning, and alters Africa's position in global energy discussions. The extension is not merely a technical document. It is in many ways a declaration. Africa is entering a new era, one built on stability, capability, and long-term vision. From Washington to Brussels, from Beijing to Moscow, the quiet extension of Africa's only nuclear power plant has triggered reactions far more complex than what appears on the surface. when an entire continent begins proving that it can master high-risk, high-precision technology not through foreign supervision, but through its own institutions, global powers take notice. And this is where the story of Koeberg intersects with geopolitics. Inside the United States, energy analysts view nuclear power as a cornerstone of long-term national strength. America's own reactors are aging, many built in the 1970s and 1980s, with billions spent each year to keep them operational. So when South Africa, a developing nation facing economic and political turbulence, successfully maintains a nuclear plant for over 40 years, it forces U.S. policymakers to confront a startling reality. Africa is no longer the continent struggling to catch up. It is becoming a competitor in advanced infrastructure. This has several implications for Washington's strategic minerals. Stable electricity allows African nations to process minerals locally rather than exporting raw or reducing U.S. dominance in global supply chains for cobalt, platinum, and rare earth elements. Industrial shifts. American companies looking for manufacturing hubs may now view stable African economies as serious long-term partners. Geopolitical alignment. If Africa can independently manage nuclear systems, it reduces reliance on Western aid, shifting alliances, and political influence. In other words, Koeberg quietly challenges decades of American strategic assumptions. In Europe, the reaction is even more conflicted. Germany has shut down its nuclear plants. Belgium and Switzerland face pressure to do the same. France, once the global leader, is struggling with aging reactors and maintenance delays. To these nations, Koeberg's renewal is a mirror, and what they see is uncomfortable. A continent often treated as in need of guidance is succeeding where they are faltering. European analysts now face a difficult question. How did Africa maintain what Europe abandoned Russia and China, however, view Africa's nuclear ambitions as a strategic opening? Russia is already building the massive El Dabaa plant in Egypt. China is pushing small modular reactors, SMRs tailored for developing nations. Koeberg's success strengthens both countries' arguments Africa is ready, and we are willing to help it rise. As Western influence declines, Russia and China gain soft power through technology partnerships. But the most important reaction is not from Washington, Paris, or Beijing. It is from African capitals themselves. Koeberg has become a psychological trigger. It proves that Africa can build, maintain, protect, and regulate nuclear systems without losing control to foreign powers. And when that barrier falls, other barriers fall with it. The fear of advanced engineering, the fear of long-term planning, the fear of self-reliance. Across Africa, this shift echoes beyond energy. It touches governance, sovereignty, and national identity. This is where broader movements come into the conversation. Countries like Burkina Faso, under leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré, have already embraced a philosophy of independence, rejecting foreign-imposed models and insisting that Africa can define its own path. For many observers tracking Africa news, Koeberg's extension feels like another chapter in a continental awakening. Whether America is ready or not, whether Europe approves or not, Africa is stepping into a new era, one where advanced technology is no longer a foreign concept, but a domestic capability. Koeberg's extension is not just a win for South Africa. It is a signal to the world Africa is preparing to compete. In the end, the story of Koeberg is not really about concrete walls, steel vessels, or the glow of uranium fuel rods. It is about something much deeper, something far more powerful than electricity. It is about a continent reclaiming its narrative. For decades, Africa has been framed as the place that must be helped, guided, supervised. The place that could not possibly manage the world's most delicate technologies. Yet here we stand, looking at a nuclear plant built in the early 1980s, still humming with precision, still meeting standards that challenge even the wealthiest nations. And now officially licensed to run safely until 2045. If there is a warning in this moment, it is this: the world must update its assumptions. Because Africa is no longer waiting for validation. It is building its own competence, its own systems, its own future. And the nations that fail to see this shift, the ones still clinging to outdated stereotypes, may find themselves unprepared for the new balance of power that is emerging. But there is also an opportunity, a hope, a widening horizon. When a single plant proves that Africa can master nuclear energy, it unlocks imagination across the continent. It tells young engineers that they do not need to leave home to work on world-class technology. It tells policymakers that long-term planning is not only possible, but necessary. And it tells global investors that Africa is no longer defined by fragility, but by ambition. This shift echoes far beyond South Africa, in places like Burkina Faso, where leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré are openly challenging old systems and insisting on sovereign development. Koeberg feels like part of a larger story, a continental awakening that many who follow Africa news have sensed for years. A story about dignity, a story about capacity, a story about rising without permission. And now the question moves to all of us, to you watching from your home, thinking about the world your children and grandchildren will inherit. What happens if more African countries choose this path? What happens when the continent is powered not by shortages and unpredictability, but by stable, clean, decades-long electricity? And which global powers, if any, are truly prepared for an Africa that controls its own energy destiny? If you believe these questions matter, if you believe that truth is more important than headlines, and if you believe that Africa deserves to be understood, not underestimated, please like, share, and subscribe. And tell us in the comments, do you think Africa is entering a new era of real sovereignty? And will you be one of the first to recognize it?